Motion be agreed to. Leave the call to the member for Holt.
Thanks, Deputy Speaker. It's a great honour to rise tonight to speak on this motion by the Prime Minister on the 100th anniversary of the landings at Gallipoli. And what prompted me in particular to speak at this late time was the fact that, as I understand it, the speeches and the names of those who spoke will be taken to the memorial and bound. And there's a particular reason why that then precipitated me to speak that I'll touch on later. Deputy Speaker, this motion that commemorates and honours those that served our country at Gallipoli and other theatres of conflict is, I think, a key to, in the speeches that I've heard, is a key to understanding what makes us Australian. The Gallipoli story, the story of our Anzacs, is part of the Australian story, the Australian narrative, an ongoing narrative. And I noticed that when listening to the speeches of many of my colleagues that have spoken and reflecting on how Anzac Day has been viewed over time to now how it is being viewed, and I'm very heartened by how it's viewed now, because it is somewhat different to how it was viewed when I was going to school at Christian Brothers College in Adelaide in 1979. There was a particular book that was written about that Anzac Day. It was called One Day of the Year, and it was a pretty dark book. It talked about It sort of framed, I think, Anzac Day as the day where war was being glorified and war was being commemorated. And to our family, the Mackworth family, my mother's family, the fact that that was how Anzac Day would be portrayed was quite disheartening. And it was disheartening for that family, for my mother's family, because my mother's father had served in the Western Front and been gravely injured. My reflections of Anzac Day, Deputy Speaker, are very informed by a picture on the mantelpiece of my grandmother's home in George Street, Parkside. As a young man, my grandmother died in 1979. I used to wander into the lounge of a very small place, a small two-bedroom home in George Street, Parkside, and there above the mantelpiece was a picture of a young man, a very well put together, handsome young man in the Australian uniform before he went overseas. He was 22 years old when he left these shores, of a young man that had a very bright future, staring into the future, a young, optimistic young man. And I've been recently looking through the records, through the National Archives of his service, and the person I talk about is my grandfather, William Harold Luxton Percy Mackworth, who served in the 16th Infantry Battalion, and he served and was gravely injured in 1916. He was blown up, effectively, in Pozières in the Somme Valley. And so, as I said, to the stories of what actually happened to this man, a young man who went over there, and when I hear about the glorification of war, and I heard from my mother, my grandfather died in 1949. I never met my grandfather. I know my grandfather only through the stories of my grandmother and my mother's brothers, Bill Mackworth, who's passed, Lance Mackworth, Maxie Mackworth, Johnny Mackworth, Terry Mackworth, Shirley Mackworth, Betty Mackworth, and my mother Colleen Mackworth, now Byrne, obviously. And I heard about a wonderful man. My grandmother, Kathleen Winifred Daly, married him in 1920. Married him after he'd come back from England, after he'd been repatriated after spending 12 months in a hospital, gravely injured. There was no glorification of war from my grandfather, Deputy Speaker. There was a young man that had served his country and had been blown up and had spent 12 months in a hospital in Britain after he'd been blown up in 1916. And when that person came back, it was a very different person that left the shores to embark on, I guess, that great adventure. I looked at the statement, the oath to be taken by the person being enlisted. This is the certificate of the attesting officer, and this was done around Gawler. And it was, I, William Harold Luxton Percy Mackworth, swear that I will well and truly serve our Sovereign Lord the King in the Australian Imperial Force from the 5th of August 1915 until the end of the war, and a further period of 4 months thereafter, unless sooner lawfully discharged, dismissed or removed therefore, and I will resist His Majesty's enemies and cause His Majesty's peace to be kept and maintained, and that I will in all matters appertaining to my service faithfully discharge my duty according to the law, so help me God. Lance Mackworth. That was in Adelaide, South Australia. I wonder what was going through that young man's mind. Basically, 100 years ago, having signed a copy of this piece of paper, and then what was in that young man's mind when he came back, a shattered individual. 13 operations on an arm that they wanted to amputate, but he refused to allow it to be amputated. And so for those, I guess, when I used to read about books like The One Day of the Year and others that said that he glorified war, not to my family it didn't, not to my family at all. They had a man that came back, and my mother, when I asked my mother, I told my mother that I was going to speak about this today. She wanted me to say to this place, and I guess for the Hansard and therefore for history, that he was a very good man, notwithstanding the very grave injuries that he had in his upper and lower bodies, that he was a good husband to his wife, a wonderful father to his children, but he suffered. The previous speaker, I think the member for Parkes, spoke about how people dealt with post-traumatic stress disorder and what happened. And basically what happened to my grandfather is that he would basically lock himself away for 3 days and drink and drink and drink until he got through that episode, and then he'd walk out. But funnily enough, Deputy Speaker, when you asked him or asked about, well, did my grandfather ever talk about it? Like a lot of people that served in the First World War at Gallipoli and elsewhere, he never spoke about it. He never spoke about what he actually went through. I think bits and pieces perhaps to my grandmother, but that's it. The sons and daughters of this man never really knew. We've had to find out through research exactly what he went through. And I think it's important, therefore, as I said, for me, on behalf of my family, Deputy Speaker, to say how much we valued his service to our country. And we're sorry that, in a sense, that we're not there to be able to pay appropriate respects, but I guess and I hope in this contribution that I've made on behalf of the Mackworth family that we do, that he will be remembered. He never really fully secured ongoing employment post his return to Australia. But as I said, for the family, the Mackworth family, I hope that this statement offers them some comfort and some gratification that their grandfather and their father would be remembered, and their grandfather, and to the grandchildren as well. It is the story of Gallipoli, the story of our service and the service of our service people and our servicemen in the First World War, is an essential part of the story. I think when we started visiting this, and I've got to give credit to former Prime Minister John Howard with respect to the work that he did in reshaping the country's narrative with respect to this, that we've landed in the right place when we have a discussion about what Gallipoli means to Australian people, to our country and to our country's future. And one thing I remember when I see the prisms of Anzac Day and Anzac and the legend of Anzac, a couple of incidences. I've had the privilege of flying onto the deck of the USS Carl Vinson in 2003. I was invited. And I flew on with a gentleman that was in battle fatigues, and after 5 attempted landings, we finally got onto the deck of the Carl Vinson, and this is a 340-metre ship. It's a big ship, a 75 aircraft. The USS Carl Vinson launched the first strikes on Afghanistan from the decks of the Vinson post-September 11. It has significant meaning to the American people. When we finally landed, the crew, basically, we got off the plane, and the particular gentleman in battle fatigues was surrounded by the Americans. That gentleman was Duncan Lewis, then the Brigadier General commanding the SAS, who had troops in Afghanistan, and now Director General of ASIO. But the warmth and regard that the Americans had for the Aussie soldiers, the Anzacs, the ones, as the commander of the fleet said, the Anzac spirit, says everything about the incredibly rich legacy that our Anzacs have given to our country, and that we remember them appropriately. And so I guess on behalf of the Mackworth family, and for me to the Mackworth family, thank you for the service of William, Harold Luxton, Percy Mackworth. That Anzac spirit animates our discussion about what it means to be an Australian. He was part of that, and I know now that we can give him appropriate memory for the service that he gave to our country. Thank you.